Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in and joining us this afternoon. My name is Susan Ward, and I'm with the Bureau of Student Wellness at the New Hampshire Department of Education. And I'm here with Dr. Raymond Suarez. Dr. Suarez is a psychiatrist from Lakes Region Wellness. And today we'll be discussing the effects of social isolation and also talking about recognizing signs of a crisis. So thank you so much for your time today, and we really appreciate you taking the time to discuss this. And I'm just going to mute us real quickly. Sorry about that. So I just want to thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to really talk about something that is extremely important, especially during this time of really social and physical distancing.
Thank you. And thank everyone who's joining and who's watching this. This is a very, very important topic. Mental health in general is important, but especially during this pandemic. We've all been kind of thrown in this together, and we're trying to fight through it together, but this is territory that no one has been in before, and hopefully we never will be again. So we're just kind of floundering around trying to help one another. And I think that's the biggest thing is helping each other. But when you compound that with the fact that we are asked to be socially distanced from one another, that becomes a little bit different in how we can do that. And, our coping skills have been taken away from us. So I think it's important to talk about this topic. I think it's important to recognize that anybody who's struggling with this right now, you are not alone. I get calls every day from people who feel most likely just how you're feeling right now. And there is no one way to feel. And I think you need to recognize that as well. The first thing that I had recognized when we first started the social distancing was that people were getting depressed. And you have two general types of people. You have your introverts and your extroverts. Introverts tended to do a little bit better during the first part of the isolation, and the extroverts have really been the ones that have been hit hard, because those are the people who they thrive on socialization. But the truth is, as we've gone on for months now, it's hitting everybody. And the reason that is because we are social beings. We are not meant to be in isolation. Even people who say they are loners and like to be alone, we still enjoy socializing from time to time. And when that gets taken away, it causes a huge stress on the system. The interesting part about our bodies and our mind is that it really doesn't make a distinction between a physical threat and a mental threat. So we do have the physical threat of the actual illness itself, but the isolation part is a psychological threat. And our body still reacts as if it's a physical threat, as if our ancient ancestors who were running from bears in the forest, that's the type of response that we're getting from the isolation. And it sounds silly, right? Because there is nothing around you, you're isolated, but your body's reacting as if there's a physical threat. So what happens? You have your fight or flight or freeze response, which is the first response that happens. The body releases hormones, usually norepinephrine, noradrenaline, and you want to run, or you freeze, or you want to just fight. So that part raises your blood pressure. It makes you hyper aroused. You become more vigilant of everything around you. That's when you get the anxiety symptoms. And then the second step is a release of cortisol, which happens with a longer term, which is definitely what we're doing now. And the problem with that is the cortisol is what's causing us to stress eat. And what happens with the cortisol is it's, first of all, a more delayed reaction, and it's slowing down digestion and things like that, but it's actually increasing your appetite because you want to feed yourself in order to prepare for whatever's coming. If this were a famine or some type of, something was chasing you, you would have to get the energy. So you want to eat. And what do people crave when they need quick energy? Well, they crave bad things like carbohydrates and fat. So it's not necessarily that it's bad for you, but it's bad for us now that we're not physically active. If you were physically active running a marathon, great. Fat and carbohydrates are great for you, but not now. And so that's when people are starting to put on weight and they're stress eating throughout the day. And then the next step would be oxytocin gets released. And people often forget about this one, but we like our little sayings in psychiatry. So you have the flight or fight or freeze, and oxytocin tends to be your tend and befriend hormone. So what does that mean? That's the hormone that's going to cause us to hunker down and stay with people who are like us, because evolutionarily, people who are like us are our family and close relatives who we were surrounded by. So people have dug into their communities. It also causes that maternal instinct of caring for people, other individuals. So you'll see that people now are wanting to do good things for others. They're trying to do these altruistic things because our hormones are telling us to do that. But the system is all out of whack right now because it's not normal in terms of stress. And so what can we do to deal with that? Well, first, we need to recognize that something's going on. So how do you recognize that somebody's not doing well? What I like to tell people is, you know yourself and you know your close friends and family better than any doctor, therapist, or anybody else will know them. So you look for changes. Have there been changes in behaviors? Depression doesn't have to look like a sad person. Depression can look like a lot of different things. So some people will isolate when they get depressed. They'll just go into their shell and they're not going to do the things that they did before. But the key is that they did before. So if somebody was never an outgoing person and now they're the same, that's not a change. But if somebody was an outgoing person before and now you notice, they're not really interacting as much, they're not answering the phone, they're not laughing at jokes, things like that, that's a change. A big thing to look for is what we call anhedonia, which is a big word for loss of pleasure in things that you used to find pleasurable. If you used to enjoy watching movies or talking on the phone with friends, but you don't feel that same joy anymore, that's a sign that something's not right. Something may be wrong. You used to enjoy going for walks outside, and I know they're limited now, but you don't really get that same joy or satisfaction. Something's changed. So look out for those things. You're going to look for big changes. Some people get more irritable. So you might find that people are snapping at each other more. Their threshold for stress tolerance has gone down. That's also a change. And so you want to check in with people, asking things. How are you feeling? Are you depressed? Do you feel sad? A big thing is suicide that we want to watch for. We're seeing, I was just reading some articles about some physicians, one in New York, that committed suicide because of all the stress that's going on. And that person had no history of any mental health issues. It's just the stress from what's going on now. And I believe that there's also maybe some neurological changes that are happening with the COVID infection, post-infection. But just the stress alone is enough to cause people to start thinking about ending their life. And you add on social isolation, and it's a lot. So a misconception is, well, I shouldn't ask somebody if they're feeling suicidal because then they're going to think that they should commit suicide. That never happens. So it's always okay to ask. And quite the contrary, people sometimes are very much relieved by the fact that somebody brought it up. It's very difficult to bring that topic up, obviously. And if somebody takes that first step and breaks the ice and says, hey, I notice you're not yourself, you're not acting the way you used to act. Are you feeling okay? Have you been thinking that maybe life's not worth living, or have you thought about hurting yourself? Have you tried to hurt yourself? These are things that you can ask outright, and I promise you that nobody is ever going to say, "Oh, well, I wasn't thinking about that before, but now that you said it, that sounds like a good idea." That never happens. So you can only help somebody by reaching out, and just be prepared for what you get as an answer. So if somebody is in crisis, you can always call 911. That's always an option, and they will get you help, and ambulance will come. You can call your local emergency room, and they can help you to get help for somebody in crisis. And remember that being in crisis and reaching out for help doesn't mean that you're going to get locked up or put away in a hospital, things like that. It's just reaching out for help and getting the help you need. I can tell you, I'm the chief of psychiatry at Lakes Region Hospital, and we get people in the emergency room that sometimes we say, okay, let's just hold you overnight until we can, get you some help, or contact friends or family that can help you. So it's worthwhile reaching out and getting help. You can always call the suicide hotline, and we could put the number up for that as well. If you have a therapist or a psychiatrist that you're working with, or that the person is working with, another misconception is that HIPAA prevents you from talking to the therapist or psychiatrist. And that's not true. What that prevents is, so if you were my client and you didn't sign a release of information, I cannot talk to anyone else about anything you've told me. However, I can listen to somebody else. So if you know that somebody has a therapist or a psychiatrist, or they're working with a mental health provider, and you're concerned, you can pick up the phone and call them and say, I know I don't have a release of information, so you can't talk to me, but I'm seeing this. And you can say whatever you want to say. So I think those are the big things to kind of get out right away, because again, people are afraid to talk about these things, and it's important. It's very much important. Um, so that, I think, was the first wave, was the depression, and people are still depressed and feeling isolated. Anxiety is setting in now. People are getting very, very anxious. And the reason being is that we don't know how long this is going to be. And so that sense of unknown leads to an increased anxiety state. Also, we don't have a lot of resources in terms of what we can do to help ourselves, help each other with this situation. And so, some of the thoughts about anxiety is that your level of anxiety is a direct relationship to your perceived threat divided by your perceived toolbox. So if you have a small threat, but you have good skills in your toolbox, then that's not an anxiety provoking situation. But if it's a big threat, as what we're dealing with now with a pandemic, and we have a small toolbox because we keep getting different information from news, from our friends, from wherever we're turning, and we don't know what to do, well, that's a reason to have anxiety. And so people's anxiety goes up. um, I made a list of my top 10 tips for surviving social distancing. And I think these tips can help anyone, regardless of where you are on your emotional scale, how depressed, anxious you feel. I think the first thing to remember, number one, is that social distancing and social isolation does not equal emotional isolation. So what does that mean? That means that we still need to reach out to other people. We have technology, things like this, which people are using all the time now. And I think it's an amazing tool. We have the tools, we can use it. Do Zoom meetings with your friends, family members. I know I can tell you personally, we have a family meeting set up tonight where two families are gonna do charades over the Zoom meeting. So these types of things, you can reach out reach out to especially elders, maybe help out anyone who's younger and knows about technology. Reach out to them, help them to utilize this technology. Um, if you have somebody in your immediate home, if you're lucky enough to be isolating with direct friends or family, reach out physically with them, be in the same rooms and talk directly. Eh, Physical contact is huge, and we've lost that. We definitely have lost that because of the social isolation. Things like hugs, just shaking hands, eye contact. Even with a Zoom, you're not really looking at anybody, and your eyes go all over the screen. And if I look directly at the camera, well, then that's looks like I'm looking directly at you, but I'm not seeing you because I'm looking at the camera, which is off center. And so you lose that eye contact, which is another big part of social interaction. uh, and that leads to stress. That leads to a lot of stress. They've done studies on mice. When you socially isolate and deprive mice, the brain actually shrinks. And we're talking about weeks of doing this, but the brain shrinks, and it continues to shrink the longer you do it. So, and they've done more and more studies with people. NASA does a lot of studies with the astronauts in isolation, people in Antarctica that are doing, the scientists in Antarctica that are isolated for long periods of time. The biggest problem is that they say is being away from people. And we're just very social beings. So again, that's number one, is to try to maintain social contact as normal as you can make it in this time. And you can take social distance walks with people. Walk more than 6 feet apart from people. I've had colleagues from work that go to a parking lot, and everybody parks in the parking lot, and they tailgate and just sit and talk for a while. Now the weather's getting nicer. That's a good thing to do. But there's ways around it, so you got to try to do that. Number two, I would say, is try to maintain as normal a routine as possible. And as a psychiatrist, I hate saying normal because there is no normal, but we want to do as normal as possible. So what does that mean? That means trying to keep your sleep schedule on track, trying to keep your eating schedule on track. If you're working from home, try to keep a regular hours. If you're furloughed or you've lost your job because of the illness, try to keep those same hours by doing tasks, keeping yourself busy, because you want to maintain that sense of normalcy. That's the other part of being human, is that we like routine. And so try to keep that as much as possible. Number three, I would say, is stay physically active for a few reasons. Uh, Physical activity is great for psychological well-being. It's great for physical well-being. It has so many benefits. It releases good hormones into your body so that you can deal with stress. It reduces stress. It helps you keep physically fit, decreases anxiety, decreases blood pressure. There's so many good benefits to staying healthy. So as much as possible, try to keep that routine. Obviously, the gyms are closed, and that's okay. We live in a beautiful part of the country where you can go outdoors, you can do things, especially now that it's getting nicer. And people don't realize you can do things at home, just makeshift. If you are used to lifting weights, well, a gallon of water weighs about 8 pounds. And so you can fill up jugs of water, and now you have weights in your house. You can use cans of food to, makeshift weights, things like that. You can do and act as if you have a gym. Number four, as silly as this is going to sound, try to get some alone time for yourself. So, this is a talk about social isolation. Well, why am I saying that you want alone time? You need time for yourself to de-stress. This is time where you could do things like mindfulness, just if you practice meditation or any kind of yoga, things like that, taking a nice warm bath for yourself or a long shower, just taking time to read a book for yourself outside if possible, walk in the woods. these types of things help to balance us. And even though like I said, even though we're socially isolating, that time alone briefly that you chose to have alone is different than the forced isolation, and it feels good. It gives you more sense of wellness. Here's a big one, number 5, bathe daily. As people are isolating and we're not going to school, we're not going to work, we're not doing our usual routines, people are just staying in their pajamas all day long and sometimes not bathing for days even. While this is not going to cause any physical harm to you, psychologically, emotionally, it does drain you. Um, Being clean and that sense of cleanliness, the sense of routine of taking a bath or a shower daily or on a regular basis, that helps to just for morale. Um, and it helps just calm people down, feel better. That warm water helps with calming down. So remember that it's important that your hygiene is important. Big one, number 6, is limit the use of alcohol and other substances. This is a big go-to for a lot of people because physically, chemically, alcohol hits the same receptors in the brain that medications that I would prescribe for anxiety hit. And so, people learn that they feel less anxious when they drink alcohol. And it's not a coincidence that they serve alcohol on planes because people get very anxious. When you watch the old movies, the old Westerns, what do they do before the duel? They take a shot and then they go to the duel. So why do they do that? Because it helps to decrease anxiety. The problem is that it's not a good way to do it. It's not a good coping skill, and it's definitely not a long-term coping skill. And you take a plane ride and you want to have a glass of wine on the plane, fine. But when it's every single day that we're going through this stress and people are drinking and they're drinking more and more, it becomes physically and psychologically addicting. If you're prone to substance abuse, it definitely will tip that off. Plus, there's other effects physically. It's not good for your liver. It's definitely not good for your overall health, weight gain, things like that. So it's not a good coping skill. So even though it may feel good in the short term, it's definitely not good for the long term. And it also affects your sleep pattern, which can help to spiral this out of control. So even though people may drink until they pass out, it's not a good sleep. It's not a refreshed sleep. You don't go through a REM sleep. And so when you wake up, you feel worse, and it's not a good pattern to get into. So there's a lot of reasons not to do it. So try to limit that. And then piggybacking on that for sleep, it's okay to take naps during the day. Power naps are actually very good to take during the day, but be careful, especially when we're not taking a regular schedule here. You want to limit your naps to under 25 minutes, preferably 15 minutes is the ideal, but try to keep them under 25 minutes and try not to do them too often during the day because that's going to upset your sleep pattern at night. And that's going to put everything into a tailspin. Poor sleep will lead to irritability. It can worsen depression. It can cause weight gain, increase anxiety. So these are all bad sequelae that we're trying to avoid. Number 8, I would say eat healthy and be mindful of your eating patterns. I touched on before how cortisol is going to cause us to stress eat, but we want to try to keep healthy snacks around. Be mindful of are you really hungry? Check in with yourself. Am I really hungry or am I bored? Because we also eat when we're bored. And if you can notice the patterns that you go through personally, you can kind of offset that because it's very easy to make those trips constantly to the refrigerator. If you are finding it difficult to do this, just put a note up on the refrigerator, a little sticky note. Are you really hungry? Just have it there. So that's kind of a reminder for you to think, take a step back. Am I really hungry? Another good tip for mindful eating, have your snack, but Also drink a full glass of water after you have your snack, and then walk away, wait at least a half an hour before you go back for anything else. Because if you're still hungry, you're going to be hungry in a half an hour. If it was just that you were bored, or you want to give that food a chance to actually register with your brain that you're full, drinking that water helps to expand your stomach. And that's another point, is that when people are dehydrated, they also feel hungry. So drinking water can help with that. Um, Very important, limit exposure to news. I'm not saying don't follow the news, but limit your exposure. Watching the news all day long, being glued to the TV or podcast, things like that is not going to be helpful. Limit it to a certain time of day, preferably not in the evening times before you go to bed if you're prone to anxiety, because that's just going to raise your anxiety before you go to bed. Morning, later mornings are usually ideal. And just say, okay, I'm going to watch the news for an hour and that's it, and then walk away. It's very important, because again, it's not going to help you, and it only will to reinforce this anxiety pattern. And it's going to put you down a bad spiral. And the last one, despite the fact that we're using screen time now, limit screen time, especially around bedtime. Uh, Screen time affects our sleep patterns. The blue light from anything, from television and from looking at our phones, will affect your sleep pattern. So limit the amount of time that you spend on the screen. And some of these things seem contradictory to one another. I'm telling you to do FaceTime, but then limit the screen time. But all these can be scheduled into your day. Reaching out to people at certain times of day. You're seeing people that are going back to old ways, and I think that's a good thing. People are baking. People are playing board games. We're being forced to use our resources in a wise way. And I think that's fine. I think that's great. And also be mindful that there are people who may not be able to do these things. If you're in a lower socioeconomic group, screen time may not be available to you. If you don't have minutes on your phone or things like that, you may not be able to do these things. So watch after each other. I think that's a big one, is watching after each other, making sure your neighbors are okay, making sure that your friends are okay, your family's okay, in any way that you can. So those are my top 10 tips for surviving social distancing.
Thank you so much. That was incredible information. And I just wanted to touch on a couple points that stood out to me. Um, I love that you talked about HIPAA. I know there are misconceptions like, oh, well, I'm really concerned, but I really can't talk about this because of HIPAA. And you're right. You might not be able to say anything. That doesn't mean someone can't call and you can't listen.
Correct.
So I thought that was incredibly important to put out there, because I think that might keep people from reaching out and asking for help for somebody they care about.
Yes. And as far as HIPAA is concerned, there's a lot of misconceptions. And obviously, I'm not a lawyer, but HIPAA was not meant to prevent healthcare. HIPAA was meant to protect people, and primarily it started because of research, and it wanted to protect people from kind of not so nice research practices. It never really had the intention to spread to what it is today, and the fear that it instills in providers today. Um, because HIPAA doesn't prevent providers from speaking to one another. If we, for example, are sharing a mutual client, HIPAA doesn't prevent us from speaking to one another, especially if we have concerns. And it definitely doesn't prevent the layperson, a family, a friend, from reaching out and contacting the providers.
Absolutely. I also liked how you touched on the topic of suicide and the fear that some people might have, like, oh, if I talk about it, I'm probably going to put that idea in their head, and then they're going to go act on that, which is not the case. And I love that you focused on, maybe that's the question that needs to be asked for some people to open up and go, you know what, I am feeling like that, and I do need to talk about this, and having all of a sudden becoming vulnerable and um being able to feel like they can trust the person they're talking to, or and that person can lead them to more professional help. So I love that you mentioned that, because I think some people do feel concerned, like, oh, I don't want to talk about it because we just don't talk about it enough.
Yeah, and there's a just like everything in life, the feeling of suicide is a spectrum, and it's not just a yes or no type question. And the reason I'm saying that is because, getting back to what I was talking about before, that people have this fear that if I say that I'm having these thoughts, then I'm going to get locked away. And that's not necessarily true and not the goal of any situation. The only reason to be in a psychiatric hospital would be if there's an acute danger to self or others. But sometimes people are feeling as if, well, I just feel like I don't want to wake up, or it would be better if I weren't in the world. But I don't want to hurt myself. I wish I could get some help, but I don't like this feeling that I'm having. And that then causes more anxiety and prevents people from getting help. So I just want to put that out there as well, that just because you express these concerns to a provider or family friends doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be quote unquote locked away. And the mental health system is not like it was 40, 50 years ago. Our goal is to have people go back into the community. It's not to have people locked up and throw away the key. That's definitely not the goal. So again, we've had people that come into the emergency room and say, I don't feel safe. Can I stay overnight? Yes, we can do that. And you don't have to go to a hospital. We can keep you overnight and revisit that in the morning. Or I hear you. I understand that you're feeling this way. Why don't we just get you an emergency appointment with a therapist or with a psychiatrist so that you can talk about this more in depth? Doesn't mean you need to go to a hospital. But if you don't get this off your chest, you're never going to get the help that you need.
Exactly. Um, I do have a question. I wanted to know a little bit more about your thoughts on grief during this time. And the reason I ask this is, just to kind of self-disclose a little, when the pandemic first happened and there were so many surprises, and I almost felt like it was a shock every day at the number that was rising and what are we going to do, and schools are closing. I would find myself just crying for no reason, and then feeling like, well, nothing's technically happening to me or my loved ones. Why am I going through this range of emotions? And I know I'm not the only one, because just listening to other educators or other people in my life who were experiencing that, I couldn't put a name to it until I read an article about maybe it was grief. So I just wanted to kind of pick your brain about thoughts about that.
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for sharing, because I know that takes a lot of courage to share things like that. And you definitely are not alone. And as you said, people are writing articles about this. It's very, very common. It's a very complicated question. I've thought about it myself. It's a very good question and needs to be addressed. But there's a lot of layers to this. So when you look at grief in general, just from in pre COVID, that's a difficult topic in and of itself, because there is no normal for grief. Everybody grieves in a different way. And even when you look at the DSM, which is our manual for diagnosing mental illness, it is very vague in terms of what is normal grief and what crosses the lines of pathological grief. So that makes it a difficult question just to answer right
Mm,
there. But again, I think it's multi-layered, because there is obvious grief that's going on. So people are losing people are dying, and that gets compounded with, you can't even have a normal grieving process during this. So if your culture is that you have a funeral, or however you grieve the loss of a loved one, those aren't happening. People are doing these ceremonies on Zoom now. So that is social distancing, an emotion that needs to be surrounded by people. And that's very, very difficult. So that's the obvious one. But I think what you're talking about is this sense of grief when there's no obvious loss in your life. But the truth is, if you take a look at it, there's a lot of loss. There's a whole lot of loss in everybody's life. We've lost our normal. And again, I hate using that word, but that's the best way to describe it, is that everything got turned on its head. We don't have any sense of normalcy anymore. We've lost our coworkers, that interaction we have with coworkers. We've lost our close friends, our close family. We've lost our coping skills. People who, even little things that we've taken for granted, going to the beauty salon or the barber, getting your nails done, going to the grocery store, right? And I was just having this conversation with a family member today that our food budget has gone down because there's no more going to the grocery store and just browsing and, oh, that looks interesting and I think I'll get that, and oh, let me see what's down this aisle. I have a plan. We go to the store, we keep it moving, you get what you need and you go. And so I think, but part of that shopping is a pleasure, and we've lost that. So there's a lot of loss that's out there, loss of sense of self. And then I think another part of this, which I was actually contemplating this morning, is survivor guilt. And again, a little bit multifactorial in that there's a survivor guilt of, well, I'm alive and other people have passed away. And then there's also the people who have stayed home and have done social distancing, and they feel as if they haven't contributed anything to the cause. Because you'll see on Facebook, you see on social media that, oh, our essential employees and all our first line defenders. And yes, my hat off to everybody that does that, everyone in healthcare. It's a dangerous job, and it's definitely, I appreciate it. Staying home is also important, and doing a part for the overall wellness of our community. But I think people are feeling as if, since they're not physically doing something, then they haven't contributed, and then they feel guilty as well. Other people are putting their lives on the line and I'm not doing anything. And so there's that guilt that goes along with that. And so there's a lot of things that are there. And then you can't do anything about it because you can't talk to your friends and your family and just go stress relief, or let's go out to eat and things like that. And so it's difficult. It's very, very difficult to deal with. We have the stress, and then we have a lack of outlets. What I would like to highlight is that telehealth is very much up and running. Personally, I see patients through telehealth. Local mental health services are also seeing, the local ones in my area here, Riverbend and Lakes Region Mental Health, but everybody is doing telehealth. And you'd be surprised, even for medical. I was just having a conversation with an ER doc the other day that they're doing a lot of this through telehealth, through things just like this, where they'll, and we have HIPAA compliant sources for this. So the telehealth that I use is HIPAA compliant. It's secure. It's not the same as FaceTime, although they have loosened up some of the laws now. So for all the therapists out there, and you can see people through telehealth during this crisis, during FaceTime, things like that. Doesn't have to be on a secure network, as long as the client's aware that it's not a secure network. But we do have the ability to have secure networks, and so call your doctor's office, see what they have, call the local hospital. The local hospital emergency room will have all this information for you. So they can tell you, oh, these are the clinics that are open. You can go here. Here's a phone number. Here's a website. So just reach out during this time, because a lot of people are feeling this stress. And what I would like to say, if anyone is a parent out there or cares for a child, children appear different during stressful times than adults. So adults can sometimes say, I don't feel well, I'm stressed, I'm depressed, I'm anxious. Kids can't always do that. And they may present as more somatic, where they'll have stomach
Stomach
aches,
ache.
headaches. They're not eating the way they used to eat. A big thing would be, okay, so the kid didn't eat dinner, but then they also didn't eat dessert, and they didn't, they're not asking for a snack later on. Things like that, is important to look for. Kids definitely can get more irritable. So sometimes you'll see an increase in aggression with children. So they might be more fighting with siblings, fighting with the caregivers. So look for things like that. That's important. The other thing, which is not necessarily directly related to this, but has been an outcome with the increase in screen time for children with playing on video games, Fortnite. If I hear one more time about Fortnite, I don't know. I would pull my hair out, but it's already gone. That can lead to sleep disturbances in children. It can lead to anger, aggression, things like that. So you do want to try to limit as much as possible the screen time. I'm not saying don't do it, and it's difficult, especially if parents are working from home and their kids are home, and you don't have childcare. So, and this is not meant to shame anybody or to do anything like that, but as much as possible, try to limit the time that kids spend on the screen. Even making them go outside. Okay, you can have an hour of screen time, but I want you to be outside for an hour, and doing things like that can help with their well-being, because I think they're kind of the population that is being forgotten about during this, because children are resilient. They will definitely end up coming out of this better than the adults, but they are suffering as well. And so I think, we need to check in with them. They also are sponges. They pick up on everything we say and do. So you may think that they don't hear you and your conversation with, your adult friends about what's going on, but they hear it and they know it and they're anxious about it. The best thing you can do for kids, especially young kids, are very egocentric, and that's okay. That's just where they are developmentally. They just want to know that they're okay. And so telling them and reinforcing to them that they're okay, we're going to be okay, we're doing as much as we can to stay safe, to stay healthy. That's all they want to hear. They also only want to hear small sound bites. So things like this are longer, they're not going to get that. You want small bites, just little things of information, so that they can know, okay, I'm okay, end of conversation, and move on from there.
And I think you bring up a really good point too, and it kind of makes me think of modeling how you're dealing with your own anxiety and behaviors because of that and what they're picking up or noticing. So it's something to really think about when we're all kind of struggling right now.
Yep, especially with substances and alcohol. It's easy to turn to the alcohol, but kids see it, and again, they will model after their role models.
Hmm. I don't see any questions at this time on our YouTube live, which doesn't mean there won't be in the future. And those of you watching right now, if you think of a question when this is over and you're like, oh, it's too late, it's not. Please add it to the conversation. I also listed Dr. Suarez's website, so you'll be able to reach out and ask questions there. And obviously, if you need to contact us, we will get your question over. So please feel free to do that even when this is over. So I just want to thank you so much for
Thank
providing
you.
the information on this, opening up this discussion. It's really important during this time, especially. And thank you, everyone who is home and joining us today. And if you notice a friend or family member struggling, please just make sure you reach out to your local mental health professional. And if it's a crisis, please call 911. And everyone, please have a good weekend and stay safe.
Yeah, stay healthy.